With this lesson, we're going to be diving into our poetry unit. This will be the first lesson in this unit, and we're going to be learning some general information about reading poetry and information about the genre of poetry, and then we're going to actually be analyzing a poem and learning how to actively read a poem and what approach to take in order to understand it better. So when we read poetry, we have to keep a few things in mind. The first thing we need to note is that poetry is a genre of great variety, and we'll be talking about the different types of poems that we might encounter in a few slides. Also, poems have varying purposes, so some might tell a story, some might comment on current events, and when you think about the comment on current events, note that these can be events in history that were currently happening at the time that the poet wrote about them. We'll see that occurring in the poem we're reading now. They can simply just describe something beautiful in nature, and then some of them are to express emotions and varying different things like that. Some poems take time to understand, but all poems are decipherable, even if you read it the first time and you think, oh my gosh, I have no clue what I just read. That's okay, we're going to be learning how to decipher poems. One poem can open itself up to multiple responses and interpretations, so different readers might read a poem differently based on their background and their experiences. So it is important to keep that in mind, that in poetry, the reader is just as important as the author. And then also, poems should be read, reread, and pondered over. You cannot read a poem one time and expect to ever understand everything about it. Instead, you really have to break it apart and analyzing it in order to fully understand the poem, and we're going to learn strategies to do that today. There are four important elements of poetry. The first is that poetry is the pattern arrangement of language. So whenever a poet creates their poem, they're very intentionally putting words together in order to achieve their purpose. Poetry is a very condensed form of written and verbal expression, so they have to be very intentional about the word choices that they use and how they arrange the words in order to achieve their purpose, because they're not going to be as long as short stories and other texts that we read. So these patterns then generate rhythm. Not every poem has to rhyme, but poems in a general sense will have some rhythm and flow to them because poetry was originally written as a verbal expression, something that was meant to be read aloud. And so the rhythm, the flow is very important as well. Rhythm then expresses and evokes emotions and feelings. And then, like I said, this is done in a concentrated way with intensity. So everything the author does is very intentional because it is concentrated text. It is not this long piece of text where they have time to describe in detail. They have to be very, very intentional about every word they use. So there are three main subgenres of poetry, and those are narrative, dramatic, and lyric. Poems are classified into these subgenres based upon length, appearance, formal features such as patterns of rhyme, the subject, and then the situation and setting. We'll be learning more about these different things as we go on. You'll learn some of it in this particular lesson and then some in future lessons as well. So let's go ahead and talk about that first genre of poetry, which is the narrative poetry. So narrative poetry, you'll see resemblances between that and short stories. They tell a story. There is a plot, there is a narrator, there is action taking place. When reading a narrative poem, you need to ask yourself the same questions you'd ask when reading a short story. Ask about character, plot, narration, theme. Okay, that'll help us to understand a narrative poem. Throughout time, narrative poetry was the dominant subgenre of poetry, which led to there being different kinds of narrative poems. Epics, like Homer's Iliad, fall into this category. Romances, like Thomas Malory's Les Mortes d'Arthur, and then ballads like La Belle Dame Sans Mercy by John Keats. Okay, so those are the three different types of narrative poems that we traditionally see. Then we have dramatic poetry. If you have ever read a Shakespearean play, you have likely read a dramatic poem. That's because this was the style in which he wrote many of his plays. They were written as very, very lengthy, long poems. So for many centuries, plays were written in verse, which is through poetic verse, which means dramas were written using poetic techniques. Any poem that consists wholly of dialogue among characters, unmediated by a narrator, so there's no narrator telling us, describing things for us, it's just the dialogue amongst characters, that would be a dramatic poem. And when reading dramatic poems, you ask yourself about character and conflict, because those will present themselves through dialogue, the setting, the tone and language, and then symbolism and theme. So next up we have the lyric poem, and the word lyric derives from the ancient Greeks, who wrote these short poems to be chanted or sung by a single person accompanied by music. They are often associated with brevity. They're short poems, musicality, because they accompany music traditionally, a single speaker, and then the expression of intense feeling are all associated with lyric poetry. When reading lyric poetry, ask yourself, what is the reader experiencing, feeling, and thinking? And then how exactly does the poem make the state of mood and the mind at once vivid and relevant to us? Now we can break this down a little bit more. So there can also be descriptive or observational lyrics. This is when the poet is describing something or someone without bringing much attention to the speaker's personal state of mind or feeling. Some poems give us the opportunity to look more closely and carefully at something in the world around us. The reader is to focus more on what is being described than the feelings of the speaker doing the describing. And then it encourages us to see, think, and generate feelings about what is being described. So the next, we are going to be reading a lyric poem, and it is by an author named Phyllis Wheatley. So let's learn a little bit about her before we get to reading her poem. So Phyllis Wheatley was born around 1753 in Gambia, Africa. She was captured by slave traders and brought to America in 1761. She was sold to the Wheatley family in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where she gets her last name from. And she was named after the Phyllis, the ship that brought her to America. The Wheatley family ensured that she was well educated, which is going to play an important role into us understanding this poem. And then she published her first poem in 1767. Religion and her African roots deeply influenced her poetry. That's also super important in our understanding of this poem. Wheatley's literary and artistic talents helped show that African Americans were equally capable and creative, intelligent human beings who benefited from an education. So she was very much trying to bring awareness to African Americans, and in order to force people of the time who believed in slavery and believed that African Americans or people of color were less than, she was trying to bring awareness that these were equal human beings with the potential that every other human being has. And then she is credited for her impact on literature and the abolitionist movement. Let me fix that real quick. And that's going to be super important as well into our understanding of the poem. So again, we always talk about the time period in which something is written, because that can also reveal important things to us. So getting to know the times. On Being Brought from Africa to America was written in 1773, which was 3 years before America became its own nation, over a century before slavery became illegal in the United States. And then at this time, 6 to 7 million enslaved people were brought to the New World during this century. So as you might guess, slavery is going to be a topic discussed in this poem. So now let's go ahead and read Phyllis Wheatley's poem, which is titled On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, negro as black as Cain, may be refined and join thy angelic train. Okay, so you probably didn't understand this poem on first read, and that's okay. That's why we have to do some things in order to break down and understand the poem. So I'm going to show you real quick a tool that we're going to use in order to do that. You'll find this tool on Blackboard. So in week 4, right under where this video is posted, you're going to see the Poetry Analysis Guide. You're going to want to make sure that you click on that, and that is going to bring you this Google Docs. So this is the Poetry Analysis Guide. This is the tool we use. We fill this out whenever we are reading a poem and analyzing it in order to help us deepen our understanding and really think through the poem. So you'll see that there are different parts of the chart that we'll fill out. We'll be looking at title, paraphrase, purpose, images, language, shifts, timing, structure, and we're doing all that in order to write a thesis statement. So you're going to want to make a copy of this Poetry Analysis Guide and fill it out as you watch this lesson, because it's going to be a great tool and example to you for how to analyze poetry. And eventually you're going to have to fill out this guide on your own about another poem. So it's going to be helpful to have an example for you. So in order to do that, you're going to click File, Make a Copy, and then you will just retitle it. I usually title things with my last name. And then all you have to do is click OK, and you will have your own copy of this that you can fill out while you listen and watch this lesson. So you'll see that I have the Poetry Analysis Guide broken apart in the slides here. We are going to be shifting and moving around as we analyze the poem, because we're going to have to look at different things that will really help us in order to understand this poem. And doing it out of order sometimes is helpful in order to fully understand the title of the poem and in order to understand the purpose. Okay, so before we get too deep into it, we're going to go to paraphrase in just a minute, but I want us to talk about language real quick. Okay, so this is where we look at the author's use of figurative language. We look and see if there's any interesting, significant word choices, metaphors, similes. Does one device occur more than others? Does one stand out? So there's one really important literary device that we need to understand in order to understand that poem. And what that is verbal irony. Okay, we talked about this before in another unit, but let's talk about this in more depth here. So I actually have a slide devoted to verbal irony because it is so important into understanding this poem. So, like I said, an understanding of verbal irony is the key to understanding Wheatley's poem. So the definition of verbal irony is what is said is different from what is meant. Our example here, today was a very cold and bitter day. As cold and bitter as a cup of hot chocolate. If that cup of hot chocolate had vinegar added to it and were placed in a refrigerator for several hours. So the author there is being sarcastic and is actually really saying that it was not a pleasant day. It was not actually like a cup of hot chocolate. And so that's going to help us too in understanding this poem right here, because this entire poem is written using the literary device verbal irony. And that'll help us to understand and paraphrase this, is because what Wheatley is saying is not actually what she means. She is being sarcastic. She is being ironic, using that verbal irony. And so we're going to talk about the paraphrase of this poem and what it actually means. And we'll talk a little bit about how we get to understanding that as well. So before we read this poem and really break it down, I do want us to really take note of one thing that the author does that we can notice just by looking at the poem. And so you'll notice that the author does something special with the text. You'll see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words that she intentionally capitalizes and italicizes. And so these words are going to be really important in our understanding and our ability to paraphrase this text. So we're going to real quick go ahead and add those to our language box right here. So go ahead and make sure that you add in those words. They're going to be essential to our understanding. So we have the word pagan, Savior, Christians, Negroes, and Cain. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about each of these words in more detail after we do a quick initial reading of the poem. And so let's go ahead and do that. All right, so here's our poem. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too, once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race in scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join thy angelic train." Okay, so let's talk about each of these words and their meaning and why they are important to the text, and then they're going to help us better understand it as well. So the first word, pagan, would be non-Christian. Okay, so she is talking about a pagan land, which would be a non-Christian land. Then we know that a savior is someone who saves you from a, oh, that should not be apostrophe, don't know why I did that. So someone who saves you from a bad situation. Let's put it that way. So that would be a savior. Christians, we know, are a group of people who are followers of Christ. Generally speaking, these people are viewed as a holy person. Okay, someone who's a Christian is viewed as being holy and pure because they've received salvation. And then the word Negroes, so that right there would be a negative name for those with dark skin. Okay, so that word choice is important because she is picking a negative word choice there, and we'll talk about that in a minute more. And then lastly, we have the word Cain. And so we need to talk about where that comes from. So what this is called a allusion. So it's where it's referring to something that people know from history or biblically. So this allusion is from the Bible. So Cain was the outcast in the Bible. Okay, he was one of two sons of Adam and Eve, and he was seen as less than his brother Abel in God's eyes. Okay, so God viewed him as being less than. So that's really important because she refers to her race, to people in her race, to slaves at that time, as being like Cain, and we'll talk about why that is so important a little bit more in a bit. And then this is a word, it has dual meaning actually. So sometimes an author will use a word that has multiple meanings in order to convey something deeper to us. So this is one of those dual meaning words, and it's actually another spelling of the word that gives us this dual meaning. So Cain can also be spelled C-A-N-E. And so that is referring to sugar cane that was being harvested by slaves to be refined. Okay, and that connects to the last couple lines of the poem. So understanding these words right here and their meaning is going to reveal a lot to us as we get into our understanding of the text. So we're going to now go ahead and look back at the text, and we're going to try to work on, let's see, not this one. We're going to work on the paraphrasing section. So we're going to look at each line and we're going to group some of them and put them into our own words. And we have to keep in mind that Wheatley is being sarcastic and using verbal irony, okay? So right here it's saying, "'Twas mercy brought me from my unholy, unchristian land," my pagan land, okay? So you have to ask yourself, so mercy is something good, okay? Mercy is like a gift that we receive. So was it actually merciful? Was it actually a good thing for her that these slave traders stripped her from her family at a young age and took her to this foreign country? So is that actually a good thing, or is Wheatley using verbal irony here, and what she actually means is it wasn't a good thing that brought her from her unchristian, unholy land, okay? So we have to keep that in mind. And then next it goes on to, "Taught my benighted soul to understand." Now, anytime we have a word that we don't know the meaning of right off the bat, like benighted, we need to look that up. And this is going to go under the section of, let's see, paraphrase, okay, right here. So where it says define any unfamiliar terms. So we're going to look up the definition of benighted, and I'm going to copy and paste it. It's going to magically appear for you. One sec. So what benighted means is in a state of pitiful or contemptible intellectual or moral ignorance, okay? So it's someone who would be ignorant, and this is typically owing to lack of opportunity, okay? So right here, she's saying, "Taught my ignorant soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too." So it's saying, taught her ignorant soul about God and salvation. So mercy brought her from her unholy, unchristian land, which is Africa, to America to teach her ignorant soul about God and salvation, okay? Verbal irony is here. That's super important because we're going to talk about what is actually going on in a minute, okay? So that gets us to, we're going to kind of take those and then talk about the next line as well. "Once I redemption neither sought nor knew," okay? So she neither sought nor knew redemption. Is this something that she wanted? Did she ask to be brought from Africa to become a slave and stripped from her homeland? Did she want this redemption? Did she want God and to be saved? No, this is not something that she wanted. So she was brought against her own will, which is very important to understand as well. So now that we've talked about those first 4 lines, we're going to add our little paraphrase here, and I strongly encourage you to add it to your notes as well. All right, so mercy brought her from Africa, which is considered the unholy, unchristian land, to America to teach her ignorant soul about God and salvation. This was all against her will. She didn't seek it, she didn't want it. Okay, so now we can keep reading. "Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye." Okay, so right here, this is really important as well. So what it's saying here is they view her race as being less than. That's what the scornful eye means. Because their color is a diabolic dye. So because of their color, they view her race as being less than. So we're going to add that to our paraphrase as well. So now that we've added that, we can go and look at the remainder of the lines of the poem. So the next line says, "Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain." Okay, this right here has 3 of our italicized words. So let's go back and look at those words real quick. And then we're also going to talk about black as Cain. All right, again, so we're looking at those words. So we have Christians who are followers of Christ, holy, pure people. And then Negroes, which is a negative term for those of dark skin. So would those 2 words go together naturally? They kind of don't fit together. And we're going to talk about why they pair those together. And then we have the term black as Cain. And that is a simile. where we're comparing two unlike things using like or as. So we also need to make note of that as well. And so what the poet is saying here is, remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain. So these are all titles that she and people in her circumstance possess. They can be Christians, they can be Negroes, and their color is as black as Cain, okay, their skin color. May be refined. So remember how we talked about sugar cane can be refined and made pure? So they can be made pure and join thy angelic train, which means even though they are Negroes and black as Cain, they too can become Christians because their Savior, the slave owners, the slave traders, brought them from their pagan land to America. So they too can be saved and become pure. Okay? Remember, like I cannot emphasize enough, verbal irony in this poem is super important to our understanding of it. So we're going to go and finish up our paraphrasing, and we're going to add, but they too can become saved and pure. Okay? Which is ironic in and of itself because they were still viewed as less than. So they're viewed as less than on earth by the slave owners, the slave traders, but these are the same people who are telling them that they can become Christians and take on this foreign religion to them and be saved. So kind of we've got some situational irony going on there as well. And so we're going to now talk about this verbal irony in more detail because it is super, super important and it all ties back to that. So like I said, the verbal irony plays into the tone of the poem tremendously. We're going to actually make this box a little bit bigger because we have some more stuff to add to it. So it plays into the tone of the poem a ton because it is a sarcastic tone. Okay, and so what Wheatley is doing throughout this is she is showing sarcastically what the slave owners believed. Okay, so the slave owners were justifying their actions by saying, oh, we are giving these people from Africa the opportunity to come and to become Christian and become saved. So even though we are taking them from their homeland, we are giving them a chance to become better off than they were back in Africa. Okay, so that's her sarcasm, her tone is showing that verbal irony, but it's also showing what the slave owners were believing in order to justify their actions. So then that brings us to the purpose. What does the author of this poem want her audience to experience? And so this is really important because we have to understand that her audience was primarily white at this time because they were the people who were educated and could read at this time. So that's really important into knowing that her purpose is, oh, that's really tiny. So what her purpose is through sarcasm, she is showing the differences in perspectives about slavery from slave owners' views to the slaves and the abolitionists' view. And she's kind of like poking fun at the slave owners and also in hopes of like bringing awareness that their views are wrong. Okay, it's not actually a good thing that they're doing all of this. So I'm glad you're still holding on and that you're following along. We have made it through the most laborious parts of this analysis, and now we're just going to start talking about some final things to finish filling out our poetry analysis guide. So let's talk real quick about images and how this appeals to the five senses. So not every text is going to appeal to all five senses. Some might only appeal to one. For example, our text only appeals to one, and that is sight. And so she appeals to the sense of sight as she is describing how these now African-American slaves are being viewed by the slave owners as their color is a diabolic dye. That helps us to see that, and then black as Cain. So that's showing the skin tone that was the distinguishing characteristic separating people of that time. So it does use that one of the five senses, which is sight. So we have that. Next up, this one's really easy, shifts. Okay, so a volta is a turn or a shift in the poem, and we don't actually have any shifts in this poem. So easy right there. We're just going to put, boom, no shifts. The tone stays the same throughout. All right, and then let's talk about, we're going to talk about timing, structure, and then title. Okay, so is there rhythm? Does it speed up? Does it slow down? Does it flow smoothly? So this poem just flows smoothly. There's no speed ups, there's no speed downs. It just has a very simple, smooth flow to it. Okay. Structure. Let's talk about that now. So let's talk about rhyme scheme first. So rhyme scheme of a poem is analyzed when we are looking at the end of each line. And I'm going to teach you how to label rhyme scheme. So what we do is we're just going to look at the last letter of each line, and we're going to look at the rhyme scheme. So we start with the letter A. We're going to put that there. Okay. So we have the letter A. And then what we do now is we ask ourselves, does understand rhyme with land? Yes or no? The answer is yes. So we put an A again. Then we look at to. Does to rhyme with understand? No. So we now add our next letter, which is B. And then new. Does new rhyme with to? Yes, it does. So we're going to put another B. All right, then we look at I. Does I rhyme with new? No, it doesn't. Does I rhyme with understand? No, it doesn't. So then we put C. Oh, I don't want it to do that though. Okay, then we look at die. Does die rhyme with I? Yes, it does. C. And then cane, does that rhyme with die, new, or understand? No, it doesn't. So then we're going to go with our next letter, which is D. And then train rhymes with cane. So there we have our rhyme scheme of this poem, which is AA, BB, CC, DD. So it follows a very specific rhyme scheme, which is important to note when we're talking about the structure of the poem. So we're going to go ahead and add that to our notes. Okay. Now let's look back at our poem real quick. So our poem is one stanza. All of this is one stanza. There's no breaks. It would be two stanzas if the author put a blank line here, but she doesn't. So it's one stanza composed of 8 lines, which we are going to make a note of on our structure slide. And then lastly, it is important to note that this is a lyric poem. Okay, and this isn't strongly emotion-based. She doesn't use a ton of emotions in the poem, but she is being sarcastic. And the whole point of this, it is a observational poem. Lyric, which I need to be able to spell observational, right? One second. So it is an observational poem. She is making note and observing what the slave traders and slave owners believed and how that contrasts to the reality of what she believes and what the abolitionists of the time believed, as well as now what we believe in hindsight, knowing what we know about slavery. All right, and then that leaves us with just one more box to fill out, and that is title. Okay, and so we've already kind of talked about this, and we're just going to add this in right here, and I'll talk about it some more after I paste it. Okay, so on being brought from Africa to America, it's about slave traders / owners taking Africans from their homeland to become slaves in the New World. It is written by a slave with a sarcastic perspective from the eyes of slave owners. Okay, so we're seeing it through these eyes of slave owners who are justifying their actions. Okay, they're justifying their actions. They're saying that this is a good thing that they are doing because they're giving these people a chance at salvation through the Christian religion. So now that we've done all that, and I know it's a lot, it'll become easier for you as you do this practice and do this multiple times. Now we can do the final step, and that is where we create a thesis statement out of all of this. So what we do is we use everything we did in order to write our thesis statement, and we just fill in the blanks a little bit. So we're going to put our poem's title, so in on being brought from Africa to America. We need to put our poet's name. Phyllis Wheatley. Demonstrates. And right here, we're going to change this and we're going to put demonstrates differences in perspectives about slavery through word choice, because that was super important. We talked about that a lot. Verbal irony, and let's see, what's the last one we are going to want to include? Let's go ahead and look at our structure. Where is that one? And let's talk about and yeah, let's talk about rhyme scheme, because that's important as well. So we're going to add that one here. And rhyme scheme. Actually, I lied. We're not going to do that. We're going to do imagery, because there we can talk about similes as well as we can talk about how it uses the sense of sight. Okay, so there is our thesis statement. So after you've done all this work, which I know seems like a lot, you have a thesis statement, and then you have a ton of information here, here, so on, that you can use in order to write an essay about this poem. So these poetry analysis guides are great tools for you to use, and I really hope that you stuck around and you filled out your document as well, because this is going to be a great tool and resource as an example of how to analyze poems in the future on your own or in class.